morning. Welcome to this joint congress between the European Economic Association and the Econometric Society here in Europe. The conference has actually really started already since yesterday with a bunch of events this morning, but this is the first kind of plenary event. So in the name of the presidents of the two societies, I want to welcome you all to Barcelona, to the Barcelona School of Economics here at the Pompeu Fabra. It's a great honor for, the locals to organize it here. We think that seeing the number of people who are coming, we have about 1,450 people who are going to be participating in the conference, so we're very excited about that. There's a lot of content that we want to talk about. We're going to start with a panel. Before I get into the panel, I also would like to thank the people who are organizing it, of course, the people from the two societies, but also the program chairs from both societies and their whole teams. There's a whole number of people who are being involved in that. The local organizing committee, all presenters and participants, and then the people who really have been doing the hard work behind the scenes from both associations, in particular Gemma Brunner-Thomas, and then the people from the BSc, Bruno Guayar and Anna. There's so many people to thank, but I would just like to ask you to join me in a round of applause to thank these people. On some of the screens, you see kind of an invitation to respect everyone who's around. I mean, as a community of economists, we're facing some challenges that in recent years, also in recent weeks, if you've been following the let me call it the news or what's been going on. We have the codes of conduct of both societies on the websites. I invite you to read them and also to kind of think about those codes of conduct whenever we intervene and whenever we interact with everyone. This is all about the research, and I think part of the research is what we're going to be talking about right now is something that I think is research that's extremely relevant for what is happening in the world right now. It's affecting the lives of so many people, the war in Ukraine. So I would like to introduce this panel. We have three amazing speakers on this. Let me start with Timofey Milovanov, who is the former minister of the Ukraine government. He was the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Agriculture. He's now the president and a professor at the Kiev School of Economics. He has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, was faculty at Penn State, UPenn, and University of Pittsburgh. His work is on mechanism design. If you follow him on Twitter, he's extremely insightful on many issues. On Twitter, you see that he really thinks carefully about designing institutions, designing mechanisms for the Ukraine in particular. We have Oleg Itskoki. He's a professor of economics at UCLA. He was formerly at Princeton. His PhD is from Harvard. He works on international macro, international finance. He's the 2022 recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal for his fundamental contributions to both international finance and international trade. And then we have Konstantin Sonin, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. He's been the vice rector of both the New School of Economics and the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He has a PhD in mathematics from the Moscow State University, and his work is on political economy with a special focus on Russia, but also more broadly. I would like to apologize for one fact, and it hurts me. It's that it's an all-male panel. We tried. There's good reasons. Some people could not be here today for very justifiable reasons, but it was not meant to be an all-male panel. So my apologies for that. Let me start by just asking, before we really delve into the data and the facts, can you just, each of you, briefly indicate whether you know, how this war has changed people's lives. Because ultimately we talk about economics and we talk about facts and statistics. But to one extent, I mean, I see Timothy told me yesterday there's no flights taking off from anywhere in Ukraine. I mean, no passenger flights, there's military flights. But so he drove 15 hours to get to an airport in Moscow. But if you can, in one or two sentences, how does the war affect people directly?
Yeah, difficult question. I think Joel asked me if we live in fear. I think humans get used to it unless you're in the front lines. It's really annoying, the sirens and attacks, missile attacks, you know, happening every night. People die, of course, some around, and you can, but you somehow don't think about it. You simply are exhausted. What takes a toll is people who die, who you know. For example, at the Kyiv School of Economics, we have a entrepreneurship program for veterans from 2014-2016. 70% of them went back to the military during the first 2 days, and at this point, 10% of the alumni of that program are killed. So that takes a toll, where every day you learn that someone has died, and you ask yourself a question: why is it happening? In the name of what? Russia has invaded Ukraine. So, and 78% of Ukrainians have either a member of the family or a close friend who has been killed. So it's a major trauma for Ukrainians. I think that's the real cost. The rest you can adjust to, like, you know, economy, money, hardship, security. That's all is adjustable, but people is not.
And in Russia?
Okay, first of all, I wanted to thank the European Economic Association, the Econometric Society, for organizing this meeting, and all of you who came here for this meeting, because, like, the least thing that we can do is to pay attention to what is going on, because the war, the political repressions in Russia, they are going to go perhaps for a long time, and people are naturally tired and moving on, but we need to pay attention. So I thank you and call everyone to support the Kyiv School of Economics. You could, supporting Kyiv School of Economics, you could designate that, like, your money would go to building a bomb shelter, something that is entirely non-military, bomb shelter for school kids, or you could make unspecified donation, and this will go to defenders of Ukraine. I think in Russia, like, the war happens in a totally different social strata. So when I went to Kyiv in March and met people, basically everyone had their everyone to whom I speak, they had relatives or friends who were killed. They go all on funerals. In Russia, I know 0 people in a wide, like in my wide social network, people who participated in the war, who went there, who were killed, 0. It's just going in a totally different social strata. But of course, a lot of my friends, my peers, they are victims of the repression, so they just anti-war. A lot of people left Russia fearing repressions. A lot of people left Russia after the war started because they just do not want to be associated with this. So I was surprised that many professors from the High School of Economics, they left. Professors in humanities, they were not exposed directly, but they're old enough not to serve, but they did not want to be associated with this, so they left. Now they become, I don't know, we call them relocants, not to use the word refugees, all across Europe.
Thank you. Yeah, no, so I'm much less connected than Kostis, because I just didn't spend nearly as much time in Russia in the last at least 10 years. But I mean, 2 points that I was going to make. Things have been going downhill for quite a while in Russia. I mean, and if you want to pick one economic number, there was a lack of GDP growth for the past 12, 14 years. So the war is not just a coincidence of non-economic things. It's actually, I think, directly rooted in the lack of economic performance, and the repressions that have been tightening in Russia before the beginning of the invasion in 22, they were kind of another sign of things going downhill for a long period of time. And so, I mean, if you don't quite take it out of a perspective, I mean, the trends were not good before. Nobody could imagine it would turn out in a full-scale war of this magnitude, but you know, the trends were there in a way, and repression trends were there in a way. And so the second thing I was going to say, I personally was not particularly affected directly, but so I live in California, and so we're part of the like a tech community of Russian-speaking people in California, and so it just happens to be that Snapchat is incorporated in LA where I live, and half of the Snap team is Ukrainian and half of the team is Russian, and so Russian was kind of the language that was spoken. And we had these two parallel chats right at the beginning of the war, and so people from Ukraine were discussing how they should get their relatives out of the country, out of the bombing, and then people from Russia were discussing how to get money out of the banks in Russia, right? And so we had to kind of watch those two parallel texts. I was kind of not affected directly by any of it, but it just sort of, this is the contrast that, you know, we've been observing, basically.
So let's start and talk now about the facts, maybe. This is a panel on the macroeconomic consequences. So we'll have two sets of slides. Timothy is going to talk about some facts on the Ukrainian economy, and Oleg is going to talk about some facts on the Russian economy. So I suggest we start now with the slides on the Ukraine. Can we have the slides, please?
Thanks. So, yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna talk mostly about Ukrainian economy. So GDP, the second quarter, the quarter when the war started, dropped down by 37%. But the government actually responded quite well. And if there is one lesson for economy, it's substitution works, and innovation works. And external threat resolves or removes all kinds of conflict of interests and creates better motivation and trust and commitment. And so the economy has adjusted and brought back, dropped to 29% at the end of 2022 and is expected to grow by 3.5% this year. Inflation was 10% prior to invasion, 26% in 2022, and the central bank has been able to bring it back to 11% as of July, expecting 10% in August numbers. Migration, there are different estimates from 2 to 8 million. The most recent estimate is at 5-6 million. 4+ million moved to the West. That means 1-2 million moved to Russia. Net migration is expected at 0 this year with gradual restoration and people coming back over the next 5 years. Labor force projected to shrink from 17 to 14-15 million people unless there is a serious rebuilding effort. If there is a rebuilding effort post-war, the labor force will come back to the same numbers. Debt currently is at 80% of GDP and growing. We expect it to be 120 quite soon. International support, $32 billion in 2022. That's 26% of expenditures, and to put in perspective, the GDP was $200 billion before the war, so 40+ billion in 2023. That's non-military support. That's just macroeconomic support for budget for social purposes. Defense support is separate. It's tens of billions of dollars elsewhere. Monetization of the budget deficit in 2022. The lesson from this war is the economy can adjust, but commitment of external support is important, but also important that it's delivered smoothly. In the beginning of the war in 2022, the Western support was not smooth. There were a lot of commitments, but they were delayed, or sometimes they came in bulk. And so the liquidity crunch was there. Ukraine had to monetize the budget deficit by about $10 billion. And that caused devaluation at 30% at the exchange rate. Since that has been stabilized, the national reserves of the central bank are at all-time highs, historical high. Structural reforms continue, surprisingly, during the war. So the answer to the question, is it more difficult or less difficult to do structural reforms? Let's say remove oligarchs or move vested interest out of the politics and economy during the war. Yeah, actually it is easier. It's being done. There is a Ukraine facility program by the EU, which combines all kinds of support for the next 4 years. So what the EU is trying to do is trying to overcome political cycle issues and commit to the medium to the long-term support of until 2027 with a major program and provide 50% of the expected 120, 130 billion support needed, hoping that the rest, that the US will follow the lead. The IMF program, just one word, what's interesting about the IMF program is that the IMF, as recently as a year ago, believed it's impossible to support Ukraine during the war because it doesn't support wartime countries. It did. Things can happen, can change. They changed the internal regulations, and by December last year, there was a program in place. Damages to capital mostly at $150 billion. That's direct. That's comparable with an annual GDP. GDP at 200 billion prior. 50%. $250 billion. That's additional losses. That's what businesses have lost. Opportunity cost. The largest damages are to residential housing. 7% of houses have been damaged or destroyed. So imagine every 13th house in your country is gone. So that's the amount of damage, which is difficult to comprehend. I'll skip the agriculture because this grain deal happening and how we are now bypassing and moving everything through Danube. But just one number to keep, current export is at 4 million tons a month we need about 5 million to be able to export everything. And the harvest this year is actually going to be a little bit larger. The agriculture industry is adapting, and despite the Russia pulling out from the grain deal and attacking the port infrastructure, Ukrainian agriculture is growing. Russia has destroyed about 35% of infrastructure in the Danube River, fully destroyed south ports in Odessa, almost fully. But we're putting area defense there. And area defense, the geography and area defense becomes an important part of the economy and the way you do investments now. But I'm happy to talk about it more. I will give room to Oleg and Kostya on Russian economy. Kyiv School of Economics runs the tracker of Russian economy using intelligence data. So I cannot publish those papers, but this is available on the website of the Kyiv School of Economics Institute, KC Institute, Russia chart book. Monthly we give out. I think I will give you, I'll make the slides available something later, but I think I encourage you to look at the KC Institute Russia chart book, July edition. Sanctions are working, but Russia economy is far from inflection point, and I want to show you these two charts. This is the change in the trade in oil, where they are shipping oil. So the overall volumes of oil have not decreased that much, actually, due to sanctions, but there is a major substitution now goes to India and China. Now, how they're doing it, 62% of oil still is being done using shipping companies which are subject to the Western jurisdiction, and so the sanctions and price cap there matters, but the rest is being done through the shadow fleet. Shadow fleet is estimated 131 tanker. 2/3 of these tankers are old. They use Danish Straits and other European waters. They are not insured, and I think we expect an ecological disaster there eventually. The volumes are not down, but the revenues are down. So if you look at the oil export earnings, because of price cap and still 62% of trade is subject to the Western sanctions, this is actually happening. I'm going to stop here. I just want to say also that Russian Shaheds, Iranian Russian Shaheds, and Orlan 10s, surveillance reconnaissance drones, they're using over 140 elements, which are mostly produced. 69% of them are produced by the US companies. And so today, US equipment, processors, electronics is being used to kill Ukrainians, and the companies like Intel, IBM, and others could impose much stricter control and verification of what their distributors do, so they save lives. That's I think inappropriate, to put it diplomatically. And the trade is happening through China, through Hong Kong, through Turkey, and Emirates. Thank you.
So it seems that measurement is particularly hard, not just the measurement, and I would like to ask Konstantin to weigh on that, but also I guess we have to face again how difficult it is, to have a measure of GDP, because if countries now start to consume completely different things, is that comparable? I mean, before there was no demand, I guess, for bulletproof jackets, and now there is. So I guess even the basket when you calculate inflation must now look different. Is that an issue that you think about?
Yeah, so numbers like GDP is a strange number to even look at because it assumes some continuity of preferences. You're measuring it against some benchmark. That benchmark makes no sense. No one is interested in spa services in Ukraine at this point. And my personal consumption basically is down to zero because we're cooking at home and we're donating money. Donating money to a cause now would be considered to be a loss because it's then wasted sort of in the books, but in practice that saves lives. And you have an IT guy who used to provide outsourced services valued $50K to Boston Consulting, let's say, from Kyiv, but now he is operating a drone platform which saves hundreds, if not thousands of lives. And that's not measurable, non-monetizable. So there are two issues, structural change in preferences and a lot of production which goes towards defense is not monetized, or refugees, or support, or volunteering work, charity work, all of this. There's simply no market, there's no number in it. So I think those GDP, in fact, might have grown if you kind of had a model of this. But yeah, you're correct, so GDP. Other things which are objective, like the number of tankers or macroeconomic financial support from the EU, that's measurable. But but the GDP, I don't know what it means really now in the war.
Konstantin, can you weigh in on the data collection in Russia? In the meantime, can I ask the other slides for Oleg's presentation?
Yeah, before Alex speaks about Russian economy using the Russian data, I wanted to say a couple of words about data limitations. Back 50 years ago in the United States, there was a big discussion about the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union cooks statistical books, where there is a double reporting. So there is an internal reporting for the planning purposes and the external reporting for public consumption. And the United States economists, they try to run large projects to sort of double measure the Soviet data. And the conclusion of this debate was that double bookkeeping is impossible. So basically, and this was proved true when the Soviet Union collapsed, so it became known that there were no double bookkeeping, that the Soviet government just published less and less data and eventually started to collect less data. And that's basically what the Russian government have been doing since the start of the war. They are both collecting less data and reporting less data. Also, I need to note that this is not what happens in the Soviet times. The Russian Statistical Agency, since the start of the war, there were several episodes in which they would report some numbers, then Putin would say something publicly about these numbers, and the numbers are revised in a week or two, and of course they're always rewarded. They're always revised in a way that Putin was right and the initial estimate was wrong. Especially this year, it was most noticeable when they reported a rise in real incomes. They first reported a loss in real incomes over the last 2 years. Then Putin said that the real income rose, and they published revised estimates. This does not square with the data, for example, on retail sales, which have fallen, and basically every consumption product that also fall over this year. So I think that generally macroeconomic data is still reported the way it is collected. I think that the Ukrainian intelligence, I mean, we generally have very high respect to Ukrainian intelligence based on military outcomes, but I think basically the intelligence about the Russian economic data is that they just buy the secret Russian data. So there is no secret Russian data because it's just being sold to Ukrainian intelligence and then estimated by KSC. But I think the problem with the quality of data, that they just stop collecting something, it's still there.
Oleg, would you comment on the Russian data?
Yeah, so, well, I was going to go to the slide. So my specialty is international stuff, so it's stuff related to international trade capital flows. And so this is the data that's actually, oh, perfect. So this is the data that's actually available daily, right? So like, this is the graph of the Russian exchange rate, which essentially tells the, it's ruble against the dollar, which tells the, I have it here, okay. It tells the story of the war and sanctions in basically one chart, and that's the variable that's kind of available at like second intervals, right? You can see it, and when you don't have reliable data on GDP and inflation, actually, you know, like the GDP growth this year would be around 0, but it's kind of not a very meaningful number because it hides a lot of the heterogeneity that you alluded to, that there is a huge increase in the military-related parts of GDP and pretty significant decline in the non-military part. And if you talk about one number, it's not a particularly useful number, and it happens to be close to 0 this year. But so what happens with the exchange rate? So you see, so basically this was the beginning of the war and a massive devaluation, and this is this unrealized, I mean, there was a, you know, there was a financial run, there was a run on the banks, there was a currency crisis, which lasted about a week or 2 weeks, right? And then things stabilized. And so it sort of suggests both that the initial financial sanctions were quite capable in like triggering something like a run-like episode, but the sanctions that followed were not sufficient to sort of trigger a full-scale financial crisis, and things stabilized. And so Timofey actually hinted quite a lot at it already. So he had a bullet point saying sanctions work if you have to do like a 0-1 kind of thing, but they're, you know, far from being enough to stop the war by triggering something like a financial crisis, if this was sort of the goal of the sanctions. And so the reason is that financial sanctions that were imposed in the beginning, they were, you know, very impressive. It was a freezing of about $300 billion of dollars of reserves of the central bank, and the central bank got on the list of sanctioned entities. So the central bank couldn't do open market operations with currencies anymore. So this was kind of quite impressive, but then something happened here and ruble appreciated quite a lot, right? And so it was very strong all of 22. And so there were kind of these two types of comments that people were saying. They were like, well, this is no longer a market-based currency. It's all kind of driven by capital controls, and so it's not reflects fundamentals. The other one was like, sanctions are not working, what happens with ruble? It just turns out none of this is actually a correct way of thinking about it. The ruble is actually very much a market-based variable, which reflects what happens to the economy. And so let me show you. So this is something that Timofey mentioned, but basically in parallel with massive financial sanctions, what happened was that these were exports. And so exports increased dramatically with oil prices going up, and then they kind of stayed throughout 22, and imports went down, right? And so if you kind of think what's a typical crisis, a typical crisis is when people actually squeezed on the income side, so they have less money to buy stuff, and they have to go through kind of austerity, like Europe went in 2010, 2012, 2013. Russian crisis was completely opposite of it, right? Like a lot of goods became unavailable, but actually there was abundance of currency and income, right? And so this is reflected in this massive trade surpluses. So these blue bars, which is about $30 billion a month, these were trade surpluses in 22, right? And so on one hand, you kind of like freeze $300 billion of reserves, and on the other hand, Russia is running $30 billion of trade surpluses monthly, right? And so those were the things that completely dominated 22. So 23 looks sort of different, and so you kind of, well, I had this picture. So you see, sort of starting last summer, ruble started depreciating again, and so this was the reflection that actually, well, if you ask, like, are sanctions working or not? Well, yes, they work. They appreciated the exchange rate because imports were squeezed, right? So the sanctions were focused on imports. They squeezed imports. They kind of led to the increase in the cost of living. But if the goal was the financial crisis and not the increase of cost of living, right, they actually did exactly the opposite. They relieved the need to do austerity for people. They just couldn't, you know, it's a bit like a situation during the pandemic. You have the income, but you cannot buy certain services, right? There was the similar situation. People had the income in 22, but they didn't have the ability to buy certain imported goods. And this is actually the opposite of the financial crisis. It kind of prevents the financial crisis because it creates an abundance of currency and financial resources in the system, right? And so we have a paper where we kind of show that, you know, combining financial sanctions with import sanctions is sort of like not the best idea, right? They happen to just offset each other if the goal is a quick financial crisis. Oh yeah, so one interesting thing here. So, I mean, a lot of people were paying attention to, so the red line is what basically the model says purely based on what happens to trade, to exports and imports. And it was actually predicting things pretty well until the summer, right? And so what happened in the summer, so this was the Prigozhin mutiny happened around here. And this is this extra capital outflows that seem to kind of be actually driving the current ruble depreciation, right? And so so what Timofey was saying is like the breaking point of the economy, that doesn't look like sanctions are bringing it close, but some events like the political turbulence or like a Prigozhin mutiny, they trigger something that again looks akin to a sort of like a financial crisis or a currency crisis episode. And so, okay, and so the last thing I was gonna say, I mean, this is a bit of a provocative slide. It's like who actually paid for the war in 2022. So and so Timofey hinted at it as well, but you sort of see that, you know, China and India were buying this is the extra purchases of essentially Russian oil. And Russian crude oil accounts for like 25% of exports, and the oil products is another 20, and then gas is another 20, right? So, and, you know, it goes towards like 65% just oil and between oil and gas, right? And you can sort of see that, you know, basically China, so India is all about buying more quantities. And so what Timofey, so this is a $5 million barrel, 5 million barrels a day of exports of oil. It stayed very, very flat over time, right? But you see that Europe was coming down, but just Europe came down kind of slowly. It's sort of amazing that it happened within a year, but it had to last for about 8 months of war until Europe came down. And China and India became the main customers, and China is actually paying market prices for Russian oil, unlike India, right? And so Europe cut down on quantities, but paid very high prices. And so the very last thing I'm going to show you is what happens with actually the price that Russia gets for oil. So it seems where sanctions did sort of work in 22. They shaved off. So the gray line would be the world prices, which kind of skyrocketed in 22, right? They went to 120. Russia was receiving massive discounts during the 22, right? And so the sanctions probably kind of led to that these were market-based discounts before the cap and the embargo. And the cap and embargo kind of started here, but you can sort of see that as world oil prices sort of came down a bit from the record highs to like 80, 85 now, the discounts actually closed. And so sanctions are shaving off just like 10% of revenues, maybe 15% of revenues, but it's not creating a situation that's like just qualitatively different for the economy. Given $85 a barrel oil prices in the world, it's just far from the breaking point for the Russian economy. And because of that, economically, in principle, based on fundamentals, things can last for many, many months, if not multiple years, right? And so in that sense, sort of sanctions are working, but they're far from being enough, and you can sort of not rely just on sanctions.
Maybe you can move into some of the kind of more particular sectors. There was talk about agriculture, manufacturing, and energy, now that we're talking about oil. Konstantin, is your reading that what people were expecting to happen to energy markets globally, that this has been actually much less of a big deal than people thought it would be? And I'm also referring indirectly to some of you have followed the German economist who went into a kind of a serious discussion with the policymakers in Germany, including the chancellor, arguing that, you know, their models predicted exactly what more or less has happened, and that people initially were having very pessimistic kind of predictions. Is that your own reading?
Yes, I think that European economists they actually scored a big point, because when the war started, there were immediately discussions about how Germany and other European countries could get rid of the Russian gas. And the assumption, the general public assumption, was that this is a difficult process. And the economists, I remember Ben Molby being one of the co-authors of these papers, but there were several papers saying that actually the impact will not be that huge, that this is totally possible. And basically in a year we saw that it was totally possible, and the German economy perhaps is growing not that fast, that many people would hope for, but it's still growing, and there was nothing near a devastating effect that public assumed that will be there.
But is it kind of a two-edged sword in a sense that, you know, what seems resilient in terms of economies to adjusting to new supply patterns and changing prices, that they adjust very well, but that also means that sanctions don't work in the same way because, you know, sanctions are also bypassing, or behavior is bypassing the sanctions?
Okay, the thing is, the importance of this gas experiment is that with gas, there is little doubt that the German dependence on Russian gas, at least pipeline gas, was really cut off. It's not like that we are not knowing where tankers going and under which flag. The pipelines have just stopped, and there never been the LNG capacity to fill this gap immediately. So we know that Germany stopped to use Russian gas. I think that there is a political economy part to that. I think that the perception of how much Germany depends on Russian gas was sort of overhyped before the war. So it was, politicians wanted to have good relations with Russia. There was some idea behind this strategy, and they sort of pushed a bit too far the Germans' dependence on Russian gas.
Thanks. So, Timothy, sure, go ahead.
So I was just going to briefly add to this that two things that are most remarkable, I think, about 2022 is how fast Russia could switch selling those 5 million barrels a day of oil from Europe to India and China. This happened over less than 8 months. It's kind of completely remarkable how fast that switch happened. But this is easier to understand because it's basically rerouting the tankers. But that did happen over a period of 8 months. The second thing was how little of a shock for the European economy was the waning out of using any kind of Russian energy resources. So these were the two big surprises. The elasticities of substitution are way higher than even economists assumed. And then the public assumes that elasticity of substitution is zero, right? And so elasticity of substitution is very, very high when you have a powerful price signal. And so the other thing, are sanctions working or not? At $85 a barrel for oil, you know, sanctions cannot work, right? Like, given that high oil price, there would be always a demand for oil that you sell at some of a discount, right? And so the only way to really kind of inflict serious damage is bring world oil prices down, right? And so sanctions are just very difficult given how high the oil price is right now.
But I guess that was a strategy that Putin understood, that a war would drive up prices. So.
Oh, absolutely, and this is crazy. Like, if you think about China, and this is a point that Farid Zakaria is doing, any conflict that China triggers would have a negative feedback on China through the economy. Any conflict that Russia started has a positive feedback through high oil prices. And this is the crazy situation, is that it creates economic incentives to actually start conflicts because they have a positive feedback loop into the economy.
So energy is one aspect. You mentioned agriculture. We also talked a little bit yesterday about manufacturing. Timothy, what's the situation now after a year and a half in the war?
So agriculture, Ukraine lost 20% of land, and the harvest went, before the war it was at 106, 108 million tons, with 65 million tons exported on the global markets. So now the harvest went down to 75 in 2022 and expected to be 77 in 2023. Actually, it's growing despite the Russian pullout from the grain deal. We export currently without grain deal, we export currently about 4 million tons a month. And our stock that we want, like the total stock, was in July 2022 was at 20 million, and in July 2023 it was at 7 million. So we're actually doing quite well. If we don't do anything, we still can export 4 million tons a month. That's about 50 a year. Not quite 65. That was, pre-war, but still sizable. 70% of this export is done through river, ports, on Danube from which barges go to Constant, to Romanian seaports. And what Russia military is doing now is attacking these routes. And, you know, sometimes the attacks are happening within hundreds of meters from the border with Romania. About 35% of infrastructure has been destroyed over the summer of these river ports. But Ukraine and the allies are putting air defense. And over the last weeks, the attacks have become much more difficult. So Russia is using drones mostly, not missiles. Missiles is a bit too dangerous, close to NATO country, but using drones from Crimea, and it points out towards a broader Crimea implications globally, and I think people underestimate the importance of Crimea. As long as Russia is going to control Crimea, the Black Sea security, not just in Odessa, but elsewhere, will be jeopardized. And I think countries on the western side of the Black Sea are now being seriously affected by ecological damage, by mines, which just float in the sea, and all kinds of issues. So Black Sea security is becoming increasingly an issue. There's been this propaganda effort, which has been successful by Russia, actually, that they recently boarded a Turkish ship. They did not they didn't board it. The actual ship was threatened, and it just moved closer to the territorial waters of the NATO countries, and they didn't board it. But the Ministry of Defense of Russia released fake old footage of a helicopter boarding a ship, and that was amplified by Twitter in particular, and by social networks more generally, and now even reputable think tanks in the US are issuing reports that Russia has taken hostile action. So they're trying to suppress trade in the region, because that ship was going to a Romanian port, not to a Ukrainian port, and the fact that they have been successfully able to penetrate the narrative and dominate the narrative, that they have been able to harass that ship, is also a part of the effort trying to basically make it impossible to trade in Black Sea. So agenda is bigger than just Ukrainian ports. The agenda is to subdue or make impossible to trade in all Western Black Sea. And that basically makes any kind of resolution down the road much more difficult, because geographically Crimea is very vulnerable to counterattacks, and then the Western Black Seas. So, you know, and we're talking about 65 million tons from Ukraine, and all kinds of trade in food security through Turkey, through Bosphorus. So the global South kind of food security and food security issue will continue to dominate the political agenda for the next several years, until this war is resolved in one way or another. So I think what Russia is trying to do is it has tried to weaponize energy prior to the war, and now it has been quite successful at weaponizing food security and agricultural products more generally, using it as a tool to destabilize or put pressure on global South. Yeah, I don't know. Like, Ukraine will manage. Will the food security situation, will the global South manage that? I'm not so sure. Okay.
Is there danger of famine at some point? I mean, Amartya Sen used to say that, you know, famine, at least for the last maybe 100 years, is not an issue of technology, it's an issue of wars.
Yes, so there are 2 points. One is Ukraine provided food security for about 400 million people before the war. And Ukraine has not always been a big player, but around 2012, 2008, Ukraine was not a global player. So Ukraine grows in productivity of agriculture. It's a recent phenomenon over the last 10 years. And Russia has started to harass through trade adversarial actions the Ukrainian agricultural markets as early as 2012, several years before Crimea annexation. So food security and food competition between Russia and Ukraine has been an issue from the moment Ukraine agricultural productivity has started increasing. Ukraine keeps the pricing competitive in the region. And when in the East, in the Middle East, when there are issues, let's say, between Emirates and Saudis and Qatar and others, there are blockades. It doesn't always get into the news in the West, but there are internal fights over food security. Ukraine has been actually a reliable partner, and it delivered before the war food throughout the blockades. So Ukraine is an important player for food security. I've been, when I was in the government, at the meetings with all kinds of sheikhs, powerful people. They are really concerned about, they care about two things: defense security and food security from Ukraine in the region. So Russia taking out Ukraine will increase their bargaining power. Now, famine, I think what happens when the supply is down, basically the developed countries are able to buy out. Yeah, it's like the people who are in the poorest countries are suffering the most. So in that sense, it will have implications, and it does have implications already for poverty in some areas, but no one cares because we don't, in the developed world, it's just a tiny, inflation in the food prices is not substantive. We basically buy out from the developing countries the food supply. So these 2 points, yeah. Russia was kept in check by Ukrainian competition. That's becoming more of an issue. And I think countries will suffer, especially in Africa.
Food security and poverty towards inequality, I thought we talked earlier about kind of an image that in Russia, people were surprised to see, basically, when they saw images of the war in Ukraine, that the countryside in the Ukraine didn't look that poor. And Russia has a lot of inequality. I mean, Moscow and St. Petersburg are very different from the rural areas. What has the war done in terms of inequality in Russia?
Thanks, but could I make a point which is comment both to what Alex said and what Timothy said. Alex said that crisis benefits Russia. Timothy was saying that Russia was successful. This is successful and helped Russia only conditional on that Russia somehow bound to wage a war of conquest against Ukraine, or conquer Ukraine or destroy it. Otherwise, everything that Russia does, weaponizing energy, weaponizing food supply, bombing Ukraine, hurts Russia. It did not bring any material benefits to Russia. It caused the largest refugee crisis in Russia in 100 years. So Russia is massively worse off. It's already, because of the annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass in 2014, it was already like 10% of wealth lost because of the lost growth years. Now, perhaps the consumption level of Russian people would be back to the 2021 year, maybe in 2030, and maybe, I don't know, maybe never in my lifetime. So this was a war of choice. This keeps being a war of choice, and the best economic strategy for Russia, with respect to grain, with respect to oil and gas exports, with respect to growth prospects, is to withdraw immediately, compensate Ukraine for the damage, and try to restore the international relations. So, like when we say Russia is successful, it's successful conditional that it's somehow bound, not chosen, but bound to keep the war going. Yep.
I fully agree with Kostya. The war is devastating for pretty much every single Russian, abroad or in Russia, apart from a tiny group of people that might be benefiting from it. Not everybody in Russia realizes that the war is devastating for them quite yet, but I think that's very clear, and I fully think similarly to the way Kostya thinks about it. What I meant to say is, if you think of the government, combined with the financial sector, combined with some industrial companies and export companies as like one sector of the Russian economy, the war relaxed its budget constraint by high oil prices, right? So what really happened is that the budget constraint was relaxed. And as an economist, we typically think of the limits to what you can do is you cannot escape your budget constraint. Budget constraint is like you can make different crazy choices, but they have to be within the budget constraint, right? And so the goal of sanctions is to tighten that budget constraint as much as possible to make fewer things feasible, right? And so the war triggered high oil prices in the world, which actually relaxed the budget constraint. And that's the crazy, perverse feedback loop that actually, probably the Western countries should make sure does not happen by kind of, throwing a lot of oil and like nuclear energy on the world market in the times of the crisis like that, which was probably the biggest policy mistake in Europe and in the US.
I'll come back to Jan's question. I just wanted to say to Timothy and others that when we talk about the Russia losses and Russia, or because of the war, of course, we are not trying to switch the victimhood. Of course, Ukraine's losses are far larger. They were unprovoked. They are victims. But I'm just saying that when we say that Russia was successful in bombing something, it's successful conditional that on something which should not have happened and which was a strategy of, you're an international economist, I'm a game theorist, so this is a strategy to wage the war. It's not a exogenous parameter. On the inequality issue, that was one thing that was visible in the reports of Russian troops going into the southern Ukraine, and these parts of Ukraine, these are rural parts, they're not the rich part, even among the rural parts, this is not the rich part, and there were a lot of reports that Russian troops, people who come predominantly from poor regions, they are surprised how good infrastructure is, how rich the households are, that basically all the homes have the things like washing machines that Russian provincial cities would not have. And this is sort of strange because Russia's GDP per capita, the official data, before the war, not the inflated data, it's 3 times more than Ukrainian GDP per capita. So it was like an army of a rich country invading a poor country, and then the soldiers see that actually this country is far richer. And it seems that Russia's GDP per capita is very much tilted toward the large cities, which are 10–15% of the population. So the median household income in Russia perhaps is much closer to the median income in Ukraine and well behind the countries of Eastern Europe.
Okay, I would like to leave some time for questions. Let me just round up with the last kind of topic I would like to talk about here is that, in terms of looking forward, in terms of mechanism design, institutional design, market design, is there something obvious that should happen, maybe in Russia, maybe in Ukraine, maybe more broadly, maybe at the, in terms of financial markets, are there things that can be done where, the economist's approach can improve lives?
It's a great question. I agree fully with Kostya. What happened should have been completely outside of equilibrium path. It should have been so costly to do what Russia did that, this is the good design of institutions, to make the sanctions so costly that they just cannot ever happen in equilibrium, right? And so the only way to kind of ensure that is if you really, really do tighten the budget constraint after this happen. That's the only way you ensure it, right? And so it has to be a dramatic, on the economic grounds, right? Then there are, what has happened now is that there is a lot more focus on the military and less focus on the economic sanctions. Economic sanctions, we talked a lot in 2022, and people kind of forgot about economic sanctions recently. But I think it's a mistake, right? It has to be a combination of things that truly makes this an off equilibrium path action, even for people with completely crazy beliefs, right?
What I think on pragmatics of sanctions and help, what game theory teaches us that commitment is extremely important. So for Ukraine, it's not only the direct transfers of weapons and transfers of help, financial help and support. is important, but it's very important to make it long-term, perhaps longer term than a typical political cycle in Western countries. So the projection should be not only in words of like NATO generals and country leaders that there will be support to Ukraine up until Ukrainian victory and liberation of the Ukrainian territory, but it should be like as institutionalized, this commitment should be as institutionalized as possible.
In Ukraine, has it, I mean, there's of course, it's horrible, whatever the situations, but has there been a kind of a silver lining in the sense that there's been an opportunity to build new institutions? I mean, there's a lot of talk about, you know, getting rid of corruption and fighting hard to do that. Do you have a feeling that in Ukraine this is also an opportunity?
So Ukraine has been building itself since 2014, since Crimean annexation and Maidan, and it's a country, we just talked yesterday that 9 years ago, in 2014, our own secret police was shooting our protesters. Hundreds of them were killed. And 8 years later, in 2022, we have the military which is able to resist and stop full-scale invasion by Russia. So Ukraine has been growing and changing at unprecedented historical rates. To be able to transform itself within 8 years from a country which was fully corrupt under Yanukovych, who then fled to Russia, to a country which it's in teenage, but it's a proper democracy with a very robust debate. And even today, people who will travel to Ukraine would be surprised how much criticism Zelensky is getting domestically for all kinds of presumably minor policy issues, really minor, given the broader picture. So this healthy criticism and distrust towards the government and political competition is there. The war removed a lot of infighting and focused the incentives of people on a bigger picture, on the kind of fundamental objectives, and I think that's important. There is another scandal going right now about increased pricing in military procurement, so it happens regularly. So much attention by the public to it, and you know, the government, it probably will cost maybe this time the Ministry of Defense his office, even though he has been fantastic in rallying support internationally, and he's not corrupt, but I think the pressure is there. So it's true that institutions are being built even during the war, and this EU accession, EU candidacy creates a really, really major gravity force for politicians and the public to change during the war. Now, the war is there, and I think whoever expects it to be some kind of resolution tomorrow is mistaken. And like there is this desire for negotiation. I think their fundamentals are not there for any kind of negotiations, exactly because of commitment. Putin has a very clear commitment towards one single goal with respect to Ukraine, but maybe more broadly. Zelensky also has made very clear, together with the West, their commitment. So, and then geographically and militarily, Crimea is very vulnerable and very important for the Black Sea region, for the entire region, and very vulnerable. And the war has moved from, it's kind of bimodal war. It's very brutal, almost like World War I in the trenches. And it's extremely high-tech on the drone side. And the drone innovation in the drones and AI, it's a new war with AI taking decisions over which targets to acquire and whom to execute. That was not yet present. So if someone, you know, was thinking whether it's future or not, this future is now. Today, software is making decisions, you know, based on video imaging, whom to attack. It's an innovation rate is unprecedented. So like every 2 months there is a major innovation in the drone warfare. So I think the way it's gonna go, we're gonna see a relatively long war with both party committed, and politicians like the EU, for example, the Ukraine facility is actually trying to create institutions to have longer-term, medium-term commitment, which are longer than the political cycles. We'll see if the U.S. is going to respond to that. The rhetoric coming from the U.S., at least due to the election, of course, is emboldening, empowering Russia in some way. It's provoking Russia. So this is a little bit unfortunate, but I think that will be overcome. And fundamentally, I think we are looking at a longer-term war in which one of the sides, at some point, something will snap, either in Ukraine or in Russia. It will happen within the next 10 years, I think, with probability 1, because Putin is aging. But we might have to wait, and a lot of people might have to die before that, unfortunately.
Thank you, Timothy. We're running out of time, but we do have time for a couple of questions. If anyone would like to address a question to any of the panel members here in the front.
Hi, Mishra Seke from the European Commission. The discussion focused on the short-term adjustment to the war, and I think the surprising thing there is this very fast adjustment or substitution works. Now, I would like to get your view on the longer term. So will, in the longer term, countries be able to kind of reshape their model? So Russia, do we see Russia as kind of out of Europe and not part of Europe any longer? And if so, what might be the implications for that, for the growth potential, particularly technological transfer, and the embargo on the Western technology? And for the Ukraine, how do you see the situation whether private sector is willing to invest in a country where basic security might be questionable, or how to guarantee that, and how to put their public action and what sort of growth and what sort of economic structure that would be probably more resilient to this type of situation? Thank you.
So just a very quick response to it, and this is what I've been thinking quite a lot in this context, is one of the growth miracles that I think is least appreciated is the growth miracle that happened in Central European countries since 91, since 90, right? And so there is absolutely no reason to not think that the same type of trajectories are totally feasible for Ukraine and Belarus after the conflict is over, assuming Belarus is liberated as well. And so in that sense, you can have pretty actually favorable forecasts, just like extrapolating the trends from Central Europe to this region. And this is the gravitational pull of the European institutions, right? And it's very important for Southern Europe, and that's why EU, I think, is so fundamental for Southern European countries, is the gravitational pull. It's not the euro or the common currency. And so the same thing happened in Central Europe, and it's a completely fascinating growth miracles. If you look at the least rich countries of the former Soviet bloc, they are converging on the same trajectories as the, like always richer countries like the Czech Republic in the past and so on. And so, but Russia is in a period of timelessness now, right? Like the spectrum of possibilities, if you had to forecast 10, 20 years ahead, I mean, the outcomes range from like a North Korean outcome to a full reset. And so basically making a forecast is pretty much impossible, I think, for Russia right now.
Okay, for Ukraine, I'm even more optimistic than Oleg, because I think like in Uzawa-Lucas growth model, there will be so much capital stock destroyed, there is so much investment opportunities, so after the war is over, it will be a growth miracle, and one of the most unappreciated growth miracles is the Italy after World War II. I mean, you do not need to be occupied by Americans as Japan and Germany were to have a growth miracle, and you could change prime ministers every year and still be a growth miracle. On Russia, I think there is a wide variety of scenarios. I actually sort of switch to a pessimistic view. So I imagine Russia sort of like Iran. Is Iran isolated from the world? You could actually travel, like everyone could travel there, but it's not isolated of sorts. It's very much isolated and backwards in other respects. So I think future Russia is like Iranian future.
So on Ukraine, I think, first of all, investment is happening even now. There is a very interesting phenomenon that, let's say, if we take American companies, those which have been present in Ukraine, they continue to invest. There's new electricity infrastructure, there's no new food processing, there's logistics. If we look at the companies which have not been present in Ukraine, they're afraid to enter because of the war. So it's very, very heterogeneous. Some companies grow, like Ukrainian Nova Post or others. You know, I've been asked not to, or like Orko. Like Kyiv School of Economics has grown maybe 10 times in terms of revenues and contracts and students and everything. So there's growth. It's very heterogeneous. It's very, it's like during a crisis. Companies which are healthy and adjustable, adaptable, they actually have tons of opportunities. Companies which are, unhealthy, they are going out of market. On the economy itself, the economy is adjusting to the war for the longer term. We do not expect that missiles will disappear 2 years from now, even if the intensity of the war subsides. So we think the risks of the, it's like the right to air defense is going to be a human right in Ukraine, and it should be a human right in Europe too, if people are serious about this. It's as important as the quality of drinking water. So you have centers which you can't protect the entire country. You will have areas which you can protect. Kyiv is reasonably well protected. Russia really tried in May to destroy Patriot systems, and they failed. It's very well protected. And so in Kyiv, it's annoying to see the sky light up every night. And some people will die because something will fall somewhere, but it's more or less safe. Whereas that's not the case in frontline cities, and that's not the case wherever. So the way the economy adjusts is that you either have decentralized clusters, which are well protected by air defense, or you have very decentralized areas where the manufacturing facilities are small enough, they don't present enough interest, sort of one missile per one windmill. It's too expensive to destroy a plant. Actually, some businessmen I know, some companies are already doing self-insurance. They put 100 windmills far enough that if they can calculate 2% or 3% damage over a year from attacks, and they can live with that. And Ukraine will be integrated in the EU, and there will be goodwill. Much will depend on the strength of politicians to be able to confiscate the Russian assets and pay for the recovery. If these guys have the political will, Ukraine will grow. If not, it will be a bit more difficult, okay? But because the damage is substantive, but the money is out there. On Russia, I think people underestimate how deep into a hole Russia got itself with this war. There is all kinds of responsibilities. I don't want to get into politics of it, but there is collective responsibility. People will have to process it. Mariupol, official number, 20,000 people dead. I talked to the mayor, 70,000 people is his estimate. 70,000 in 400,000 people town have been killed by the Russian military. There'll be some processing about this at some point, and it's not going to be fast, and that will affect the mood, and it will affect. So we're in a very difficult situation where most of the Russian, military and a lot of Russian population is still oblivious to what's happening. They still think they're on the right side of things. So that process will be slow. So I'm pessimistic about the way Russia will come out from this. But it's very difficult to make predictions.
Okay, on this note, it's clear that it's not so optimistic, but it's good that there's a lot to talk about. I thought it was a very fascinating debate here. Please join me in thanking Timofey Milovanov, Oleg Kitskotsky, and Konstantin Sarin.